Foster. I'm a design lead at a small company called Dream Reality Interactive. We're a VR specialist. And I've been working on VR for quite a few years now. I was previously at Sony for quite a long time, worked on a lot of PSVR stuff and some launch titles for that. If you take a look at our website and Twitter handles, I'm going to be sharing this presentation also, probably in the next week or so. So this is the basis of what I'm going to talk about today, put in very simple terms. And these are the headlines that I'm going to go through today. So I'll start with a little refresher on the fundamentals of simulation sickness and the accepted kind of the triggers that cause it. And then I'll move on to what we can do about it. And I'll talk about player acclimatization. I'll go through some design principles for comfortable VR, some handy tools that you can use to achieve the goal of comfortable VR. I'll also talk a little bit about producing comfortable artwork for VR experiences, some methods for reliable testing of comfort in VR, and then finally some advice on prototyping for VR comfort solutions. So let's start with what is simulation sickness about. So this is quite unpleasant to look at. It isn't going to make you suffer simulation sickness, but it's not something that you're going to want to look at for particularly long. So let's get rid of it. So simulation sickness is an unpleasant side effect of something that's actually pretty cool. So the human brain has been trained since birth to respond to data from various sensors and to combine that data to build up a picture of the world that surrounds it. And if you give the brain data that's not expected or that is contradictory to itself, then you're going to get unusual results. So in VR, we create virtual worlds, but those worlds are never going to be perfect. And so we can get side effects as a result of that imperfection. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about combating simulation sickness. So there's a lot of misinformation out there about simulation sickness, I think. We know in game design in general that one specific implementation of an idea might be very successful, and another implementation may not be very successful, and it's usually the subtle details that make the difference in that, rather than the high concept itself. So you could make a game about hot air ballooning that's very comfortable in VR. And you might also make a game about roller skating in VR, and that may not be very comfortable. And some might conclude hot air ballooning works in VR. Roller skating does not work in VR. But obviously that would be a mistake. It's really important that we avoid associating comfort and success in that area with the game world narrative. Those associations are unhelpful, and they conceal what's actually going on. So what I'm really trying to advocate with a lot of this is to understand the first principles of the simulation sickness, to understand at the lowest level what is taking place and why a player is feeling comfortable in one experience and not so comfortable in another. And then you can make whatever you want, and you can make it in a lot less time. So let's talk a little about the prevailing theory for why simulation sickness occurs at all. And that's accepted to be a disconnection between the senses. The vision sense and the vestibular system. And when those systems don't agree with each other, simulation sickness is typically the result. It does strike me that you can't really go to a talk about this subject without someone saying the word vestibular and showing you a picture of the inner ear. So this is my contribution to that grand tradition. Now, people often refer to the vestibular system as balance, but balance is in fact the combination of a lot of different sensors, including these two. And so mismatches between the vestibular and the vision systems are dismantling the sense of balance, and that's quite a serious thing. And we get quite serious side effects from it, as many of us know. Now, the important point that I want to add at this stage is that in real life, only acceleration can be felt by an individual. You can't sense constant velocity without any visual input. So the conclusion that we can draw from this, and in many VR experiences we can use this to our advantage, is that constant velocity motion in VR can actually be really comfortable, even if the speed of travel is very high. That's not a silver bullet rule, but acceleration is the key ingredient that makes the difference in those two states of affairs. Now, no current VR hardware allows us to give input to the vestibular system. So what we're dealing with as developers is visual input. And that's where we do all our work to make one experience comfortable compared to another. Now, a key result of visual input and motion in VR is optical flow, which is defined as follows in a kind of Wikipedia type way. But in our case, the definition is really apparent motion resulting from relative motion between the player and the game environment, whatever that environment may be. Now, we use this in video games all the time, of course. In a driving game, the player is able to read their approach to a corner and adjust their speed moment by moment because of optical flow. So it's still important in VR. We don't want to eliminate it completely, but what we do want to do is manage it and reduce it in certain situations. So I'm going to do a couple of quick crash courses here. One is in visual equipment, how the player physically absorbs visual input through their eyes. And then I'm going to talk a bit about visual motion sense, how we interpret the visual input and we turn that into motion in our brains. The visual equipment, of course, is the eye. There's two types of light-sensitive cells in your eye. You've got cones, concentrated in the center of the back area of the eye in an area called the fovea. It's populated exclusively with cones, and there's a big drop-off after about 15, 20 degrees across the back surface. And then you also have rods. There's almost no rods in the fovea area of the eye. They peak at around 15, 20 degrees and then drop off from that point. Now, they're good and bad at different things, so we'll quickly look at what those different characteristics are. So what are cones good at? They have what we call high visual acuity. We could refer to that as high resolution. They also have very fast response time to the light that they receive, and they're also chromatic. They respond to color. That's where we get color vision across everything that we see. But what they're not so great at is they have comparatively low sensitivity to the light they receive, and they also do very little to amplify that light. And they're comparatively few in number. There's about 6 to 7 million cones in the average eye, which sounds like a lot, but it won't sound like a lot in a moment. So we'll move on to rods, look at what they're good at. So rods have a very high sensitivity to light, and they have very high amplification. And they're also very numerous, about 120 million rods in the average eye. But comparatively, they have very low visual acuity, low resolution. They're slow to respond to changes in light, comparatively slow compared to cones. And they're also achromatic. They don't detect color. So together, they complement each other. They give us the full and very sort of versatile and detailed sense of vision. And good VR is going to play to the strengths and limit the weaknesses of both of these. So we talked about detection, and I want to talk now about interpretation. We're going to look at the kinds of movement and motion and rotation that can take place in VR. And in order to do this, I need the assistance of my magnificent spaceship. So before we get started, I'm going to do a quick summary of the standard axes of movement and rotation. This is stuff that I'm sure many people are familiar with. We've got forwards and backwards along the z-axis. We've got lateral motion left and right along x. And we've got vertical motion up and down along y. And then types of rotation, again, known as roll around the z-axis, known as pitch around the x-axis, and known as yaw around the y-axis. Now, the basics out of the way, I'd like to talk about how these different types of motion and rotation are likely to generate different kinds of behavior or have slightly different characteristics in VR. And in order to do that, we're going to head into space. So for motion forwards and backwards along Z, what we typically see is increasing optical flow in the peripheral view of the player, less optical flow in the center. Optical flow and parallax are directly affected by the proximity of the environment when moving forwards and backwards. So for a given velocity, the closer objects are to you as you move past them, the greater the optical flow that's going to result from that. And also with this kind of motion, we have the ability to have a completely stationary point in the middle of the player's view as they move along. So we'll look at vertical and lateral motion together. They're behaviorally identical, so I've grouped them together here, although of course in use they may not be identical within your game. We again see increasing optical flow in the periphery, and we see that optical flow and parallax are highly affected by the proximity of the environment, more than for longitudinal motion and likely over a greater proportion of the player's view. And lastly, there is the potential for an effectively stationary point in the center of view, but only at really long range. So this is like looking out of the window of a train, looking at a distant building, and it doesn't appear to move. Of course it is still moving. Now it's worth pointing out that lateral and vertical motion in small spaces can greatly increase the amount of optical flow across the player's view. So they're less suitable than forward and backward motion when you're in enclosed spaces. If you strafe right up next to a wall, of course the entire view of the player is going to be filled with motion. Rotation, which is the more kind of tricky and complex area in VR, I would say. So we'll start with rotation around Z. So again, the common theme, increasing optical flow in the peripheral view. Optical flow and parallax hardly affected by the proximity to the environment when you rotate around the Z-axis. There is still a little bit of that, but it's mainly because the player's head is not typically the center of rotation. And of course, in VR, we use stereoscopic view, and so you can never rotate completely around the center of any given eye and then not be rotation around the other, and we would typically rotate around the center of the two eyes if we were to be that central to the head. There is the potential for a completely stationary point in the center of the view at any range, but it's only really a theoretical point, like a pinpoint. At any distance, a distant star would still be seen to rotate if you were barrel rolling as you move towards it. And then we'll look at pitch and yaw. Again, we can look at these together. So this time we're seeing equal optical flow across the player's entire view. Optical flow and parallax are not at all affected by proximity of the environment, and there is no potential for a stationary point in any part of the player's view. So rotation of this type is the biggest comfort risk in VR, I would say. So I'll do a quick recap, very quick, of what we've looked at so far regards the fundamentals of simulation sickness. So we had a quick look at what it is and talked about the accepted theory that it results from a mismatch between vision and vestibular input. And we can't do anything about vestibular input, so our focus as developers is based on the visual input. And then we talked a little bit about what we can do about it, and in particular, the focus there is on optical flow. So we looked at how the eye works, the different characteristics of the light-sensitive cells inside the eye and where they're positioned across the view. And then we looked at different types of movement and rotation and how they can affect optical flow, parallax, and whether there's a potential for anything still for the player to be looking at. So that brings us to the end of the theory, and now let's get on to the practical stuff. So my plan at the start of this talk, I ran through 6 ways in which we can make practical efforts to address comfort in VR, and the first one of those is acclimatization. So the key thing with acclimatizing players is accepting that it's going to take a significant amount of time. And I'd be careful with using the word acclimatize to mean anything other than a resistance, building a resistance to simulation sickness. Sometimes people use it to mean settle in. They might put the player in a sort of comfortable room before they fire them out of the plane and into a combat situation, but they might be talking of a period of a few minutes there. And that isn't how acclimatization to simulation sickness is developed. It really takes hours and days, and potentially weeks, and it requires a regular return to the game. A little play each day, as I say here. So if you imagine this bar as all of your potential players. Now, 5% of players will never really be comfortable in VR, and 5% of players will pretty much be comfortable no matter what you throw at them. So everybody else is in the middle, and all these people in the middle, those are your target. And the choices that you make as developers are going to address these people and make your experience more comfortable than another one. Now, one of the key aspects of simulation sickness is not actually impacting the ability of the player to perform, the ability of them to play your game. What it really impacts is their motivation to perform and their motivation to continue playing. I have a quote here, which is from a US Army research paper, which I'll refer to in a little more detail in a short while. Now, if the player's motivation to play is damaged, not only are they going to want to stop playing at that particular time, but they're very likely to not want to return to your game and play at a subsequent time. And if that doesn't happen, then the opportunity for acclimatization is, of course, being removed completely. So good acclimatization looks broadly like this. So we're looking at a gradual increase in intensity across multiple play sessions that might be days apart. It'll keep your players motivated to return. Not necessarily that the discomfort will get that high comparatively to the start, but if the players are getting a little increase each time, they're at least afforded the opportunity to acclimatize to that. Of course, acclimatization could take place in another game before the player comes to your particular title, but you've got no guarantee of that, so it's always something to consider. Poor acclimatization might look like this. You have a sudden increase in discomfort, the player's motivation to return is harmed, and potentially you lose them altogether. Now, this is the paper that I referred to. When I share this talk, I'm going to include links to all of these things, so you could search for these by title, but if you watch our website and our Twitter handle, then I'll try and get this information out there with an extra slide that includes links to all the documents that I'm going to refer to. Now, this was created by the US military in 2005. The 5% reference that I mentioned earlier, and also the impact of simulation sickness on motivation rather than ability to perform, they all come from this document. And it's one of the first ones that I read when I started looking at VR comfort several years ago, and it's still one of the most comprehensive references on the subject. I grant it the official status of a very useful document, and I highly recommend that you seek it out. Okay, so part 2, I'm going to talk about some design principles specifically for comfort in VR. So to start with, I want to clarify a glossary of terms. They're kind of simple, but they help me to keep in mind that these things are distinct and can be treated separately. So movement, I define as any change in the player's position or facing, whether it's visible to the player or not. Whereas motion is any movement that can be perceived by the player. Acceleration, we're all familiar with, it's a change in velocity, or acceleration or deceleration, a change in velocity that can be perceived by the player. But it's important to bear in mind that that also applies to angular motion, rotation. And this acceleration as a potentially risky thing to include is just as risky to include in rotation as in any kind of lateral motion. So the question to ask with all of these, really, the difficult question, is does your gameplay need any of them? Does your gameplay really need movement? Does it need motion? And does it need acceleration? If they're not part of your core gameplay, then I'd suggest you consider very carefully whether they're included in your game at all. So if you're making a chess game, you probably need none of these things. If you're making a cover-based shooter, you might well need movement, but you're not necessarily going to need motion. If you're making a run-and-gun shooter, then you're probably going to need some motion, but you want to think carefully about including acceleration in that. And if you're making a driving simulator or spaceflight simulator, you're probably going to need all three, and you've got a much more challenging job ahead of you. So whatever the game needs is valid. The important thing really is just to be sure that they aren't included out of habit, because the further down that stack you go, the greater the risk of simulation sickness occurring is going to be. So one of the ways that discomfort can be increased is if the motion that takes place in the game is not clear and easy to interpret for the player. So simple, predictable motion is the aim here. Subtle motion is not good in VR. It can be hard for the player's visual sense to really get a correct read of what is taking place. I mean, it's worth mentioning, whenever I talk about communicating to the player, convincing the player, helping the player realize something, I'm not really talking about the conscious mind. Like the player's subconscious, the systems of vision, and audio and all the rest of it those are going to be the things that tell the player that they are moving or they are not moving. And if you tell the player you aren't moving and their sensors tell them otherwise, they're going to feel like they're moving. So really we're talking to the player's sensors, not to the player's mind. You can't explain simulation sickness away. So in order to give the player a clear read of the type of motion that's taking place, strong visual cues can really help them detect that motion. A lack of strong references can lead to a changing and contradictory read of the sort of motion that's actually taking place. So plenty of static environmental references in the near, the middle, and the far distance are really going to improve things in that area. They create strong parallax as the player moves and gives them a very clear read of the type of motion that's taking place. The other thing to avoid is undesired sense of vection. So that's the illusion that if you're sat on a train and the train next to you pulls away, for a brief moment, you might feel like you're moving in the opposite direction, something that we've all probably experienced. So the way to avoid this is typically to avoid filling the player's view with large scenery elements that are moving and giving them a correct sense of what's taking place, so that they always maintain a strong idea of what is moving and what is not. And typically, it might be them remaining stationary and the scenery moving. And we want to make sure that that's communicated clearly to them. And if large sections of the environment have to move, then I found that applying symmetry to that movement can really help to solve that problem. It's not 100%. So if you're in a room and all the walls move away in an even direction, it's much easier for the player to get the sense that they are stationary in the middle of that scene. If all the walls move in one given direction, the player will definitely get a strong sense that they're moving in the other direction, and often with a negative experience. Now, there's something that I refer to as combination fatigue that I want to talk about a little bit. So this is giving the player extra mental load during physically extreme moments. Physical discomfort can be exacerbated by also having complete mental challenges at the same time. And one of the key sorts of mental challenges that can result is navigation issues, becoming lost, having to think about where to go. In particular, in a game, if your means of motion is physically extreme, let's say, liable to trigger simulation sickness, a player that's lost is having to travel and search in order to determine where they're supposed to go, and that, again, risks increasing the simulation sickness effect. A lot of the discomfort that's felt in simulation sickness is cumulative. So if the player is already feeling unwell due to the motion, and you give them hard sums, then, again, the damage to the motivation, the temptation to just remove the headset and exit the whole thing because it's starting to feel like work and not fun is something that's really got to be managed. Yeah, sorry. So combat in physically extreme environments is something that can overload the player. In particular, if you're moving backwards or you're moving over uneven surfaces. And if movement is a combat mechanism, and often used defensively, then that's going to remove agency from the player. So they're not able to choose when to move when they're feeling that it's comfortable to do so. The combat and the enemies that are around them are going to force them to move in reaction to what's taking place. And if that is relentless, then the player is going to end up, again, being overwhelmed potentially by simulation sickness in a way that they would avoid if they were the only initiator of that movement. So placing your combat in larger, more open areas will reduce optical flow and make that combat more bearable. And the last one is simple enough. It's providing rest moments. It's almost so simple that it can be overlooked sometimes. If you have sequences of extreme gameplay, then giving the player an opportunity to recover from those in a calmer space, typically without motion, if your game includes motion, is going to allow them to get further through the game and, again, increase the chances that they're going to come back for another go. And the final point in this area is about using suitable assets when you're grey box testing. I'm sure some of you have heard about this one already. You've got to avoid measuring comfort levels of your early gameplay using grey box assets. It's very easy to make a game that appears to be comfortable, and then you start to add in the detail, and problems start to come out of the woodwork. Because grey box isn't going to convey the final texture parallax. It's not going to give you a strong enough sense of the edge parallax compared to your final art, unless your art style is grey box, of course. And it's not going to convey, above all, the final optical flow. So you've got to test with something that's approximating the visual detail of the sort of game environment that you're going to use, and that includes roughly the same lighting levels as well. So developers will often talk, I found, about striking a balance between fun and comfort, especially if something that would normally be awesome outside of VR is having to be changed in some way to make it comfortable inside VR. And people will often assume the worst of that change and talk about the change reducing the fun or making the game less fun. But what I would say is the problem with finding a balance between comfort and fun is that in practical terms, there isn't one. Fun, of course, is measured on a broad sliding scale. There's some fun up the left side of the screen. And it can, like investments, go down as well as up. Now, whilst comfort levels aren't completely analog, I would say that for any given player, it's much more of a threshold. And if that threshold is crossed, then nothing will be fun. And anything that makes the player uncomfortable, no matter how exciting it seems to be on paper, is not contributing to the fun. It is, in fact, reducing it. And so the only solution is to find effective ways to improve comfort that allow your gameplay to thrive as well. And the best way to achieve that goal is to build the game from the beginning with both of those things in mind. Okay, so the practical toolkit. This is what I would hope is a series of techniques or mechanics that, if appropriate to your gameplay, if they can be included, will make your game more comfortable by degrees through their use. I'm going to list them out before we get going. I hope this is the only time that I read out a list of words to you that you can see with your own eyes on the screen. So we've got blinders, we've got dash movement, dash rotation, what I'm calling dark movement for the purposes of this presentation, and then static references. So let's start with blinders, sometimes referred to as blinkers. Maybe some of you are already familiar with this from some of the VR titles that have been released recently. In my experience, this is probably the most effective means of reducing simulation sickness in games where a high degree of motion is key to the gameplay and can't be simply removed. The first video I want to show you is an excerpt from Scavenger's Odyssey, which is part of the PlayStation VR Worlds. It was a launch title, and I worked on this system with other colleagues at Sony. So what you can see here is the blind is extending from the sides of the player's view during extreme maneuvers. And although they're fairly noticeable on the screen, they're actually barely registered by the player in the headset when they're playing the game. Now, there's a couple of particular aspects of the behavior which are visible on the screen, but I'd like to bring your attention to in particular. In this particular case, the players are being clearly driven by the motion of the player craft. So movement and rotation at different speeds in different directions is causing the blinders to be extended from different edges by different degrees, with the most severe of motion resulting in full extension around all sides of the screen. The other aspect that I want to point out with this is the speed at which they extend and retract. The blinders are actually extending faster than they retract, and there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is when the environment is moving, the movement of the blinders is going to be less noticeable to the player, so they can extend at a higher speed while still remaining discrete. The second, more important reason is that when you start moving, the blinders have a job to do. The risk of simulation sickness is increasing. The blinders need to be extended promptly in order to be able to combat that. When motion has ceased, they don't really have a job to do at that time, so they can they can retract more gently and still remain discrete. There's a second example of this that I'd like to show you. This is from Eagle Flight by Ubisoft Montreal. So this game took on the challenge of making high speed and highly agile flying comfortable in VR. And they did an exceptional job of reaching that goal. You can see in this video that in Eagle Flight, the blinders are deployed in reaction to two different player behaviors. One is making sharp turns, no matter the environment. The other is proximity to scenery, in particular through this scene that we're seeing in a very timely way just now. So they've wired their blinders directly to the two actions that are most likely to increase optical flow in the player's view within this particular game. It's the kind of thing that would vary from one game to another, what you use to trigger them. But as I say, in high motion gameplay, this is one of the most effective methods. And I really wouldn't be put off by the fact that on the screen, when viewed on the TV, they intrude a lot on the player's view. We often found in tests that when you asked people what was different, they wouldn't notice that the blinders were actually present and having an effect. So I'd like to look at what I've called dash movement. In the video I'm going to show you, it's actually referred to as ludicrous speed. With all of these examples, with the exception of scavengers, they're made by other people, and I'm just kind of bringing them together for you. So dash movement, it's a variant on teleporting. You know, a lot of people know that teleporting is quite comfortable in VR because, as I talked about at the start, it's movement, but it's removing the motion from that experience. But the key advantage of dash movement is that the motion still remains visible to the player, and so their spatial awareness is greatly increased. In particular, in any game that's high action, that you're going to be using this kind of action in sequence very quickly, it makes a real difference to the player's ability to still maintain a sense of where they are. The demo, as you can see, is by a chap called David Finstwalder. Sorry, mispronounced his name. So the key thing here is that the motion always takes 100 milliseconds to complete, regardless of the distance that's covered. Now, it's over so quickly that you don't really sense it as motion, but it is witnessed by the player, kind of retrospectively. And that slight difference to teleport allows the player to maintain a very strong sense of position and change in position. Now, it's worth noting that dash movement's only effective when there's no kind of non-player initiated rotation that takes place during the transition. If the player's view was to be rotated by any significant amount during that transition, the benefit of it being dash movement would be lost. The spatial awareness would be undermined. It might as well be a straightforward teleport. And it's also, of course, worth mentioning that this system is only suitable for games where the gameplay is not part of the actual movement, part of the actual motion, such as a run-and-gun shooter. But if your gameplay is based around individual locations, but moving between them at some fair speed, and you're not a fan of teleport, I would say that this is a very effective solution. So many of you might have come across stepped rotation. This is used in situations where the gameplay involves rotation of the player in real time, typically around the y-axis, yaw. And as we know, that's one of the most uncomfortable things that you can do in VR. So stepped rotation, for those unfamiliar with it, is continuous rotation based on continuous input will make the player rotate in a series of stages with a delay between each of those changes and a fixed number of degrees. As a result, angular motion is never visible to the player, which helps a lot with discomfort, but the result, to my eyes, can sometimes look a bit tech demo, and it can also be disorientating for some players, harming their spatial awareness. So what I refer to as dash rotation is to stepped rotation, what dash movement is to the teleport, instead of snapping the player's view in a series of degrees, overall rotation is divided into a series of very small but incredibly fast rotations. So it's easier to see that taking place. So I'm going to show you this here. It's used in Resident Evil 7, as you can see at the top. It takes a little bit of time to get going. So the method of rotation is just as effective as stepped rotation in combating simulation sickness, but like dash movement, it allows the player to maintain a stronger sense of spatial awareness. Now, viewed on a screen like this, it can look a bit confusing, a bit unintuitive, but viewed within the headset, within VR, it's actually quite a natural behavior. And to my eyes, it just looks that little bit better than stepped rotation, a little less tech prototype. The next one I'm calling, in this particular presentation, Dark Movement. And that features in a game called Smash Hit Plunder. It's the only game I've seen it in, but it's a really elegant solution. It's really worth including. They actually call it Dark Mode within the game, but I renamed it just to be clear about what aspect it's focusing on. So as you can see, this system works by making the world around you dark whenever motion would begin, when movement begins. You can still see scenery elements that are very close as you move by them, and they also mark out the path with the little footprints so that you can see clearly where it is you're actually heading to. I would suggest that if you're looking at using a system like this in one of your own games, you could probably experiment with the radius of the dark area. And if you test it correctly, I think you could find a place where it might be a little larger, but it would still improve comfort greatly. And also, like dash movement, the system only works if your gameplay allows for you to pick a destination and then head to that destination. And there isn't like sort of second-by-second gameplay during the motion. But if that's suitable for your game and you're not a fan of the teleport-related systems, I think this is a really strong alternative. And I'd like to talk, the last thing I'd like to talk about in this area is static references. So these are elements added to the game that move with the player, and they're divided into two rough groups. Elements that are static to the player's view, such as a helmet, and then elements that are static to the player's body, such as a cockpit. So the blinders that we looked at earlier, besides reducing optical flow in the periphery, they are a form of static reference that is attached to the player's view. I'd like to use a short video from the Riggs game on PSVR for this. They use blinders as well, but they also do a very good job of using a cockpit to provide a static reference that is static relative to the player's body. Now, some games use a cockpit and have the cockpit moving around during the gameplay, and whilst that adds to the sense of realism, it does make it less effective as a comfort measure, and it's worthwhile kind of considering the benefits of each of those. So the Riggs cockpit remains static to the player's view at all times, which makes it a very effective contributor to improving player comfort. So the next section I'd like to cover is a little bit about artwork for comfortable VR. I'm going to cover a few lessons specific to VR comfort here. I'd recommend that if you're interested in a presentation about artwork for VR in a more general sense, this one was published by an ex-colleague of mine at GDC a couple of years ago. Again, I'll link to this when I share the presentation. It's definitely worth checking out. So I'm just going to talk about, as I said, like art aspects that are specific to VR comfort. And the first one I want to talk about is environmental particles, often referred to as air particles, though of course they can be used in any setting and in any kind of environment. They're very useful in open spaces where there is no environmental geometry to give the player a strong read on what kind of motion might be taking place. They help the player to read any kind of movement and increase their spatial awareness. But be aware that if the particles have a lot of movement to them themselves, or if they appear to overall move in a single direction, that could create an undesired sense of vection and perhaps even do more damage than if the particles weren't there at all. So a low degree of movement and either symmetry or chaos in the movement of those particles is desirable. If they're absolutely static in the air, they'll still do their job, but they may look a little artificial, so it's a kind of balancing act that needs to be carried out. Next thing I want to talk about is contrast, and the advice here really is that you must beware of high contrast surfaces in your environment. Here's some horribly high contrast stuff to look at. Now this creates a very strong optical flow in the player's view, and if regular patterns are used, such as here, then strobing could also be the result, which is particularly unpleasant in VR. Note that the same effect can result from a combination of textures, lights, shadows, reflections. So you have to watch for this issue in the headset, really, to kind of get a true picture of what is going to be the result that the player will witness. So reducing the contrast in your environment will help reduce the discomfort for players as they move through that environment. And closely related to that is surface detail. Particularly important is that you avoid busy textures and surfaces as they greatly increase optical flow. So high detail surfaces in the environment through which the player moves can be the #1 contributor to discomfort in a game that involves a lot of player motion. Smoothing out the details, in particular in areas that are nearest to the player, can make a really positive difference. Now, there's one particular implementation of that I'd like to refer to, going back to rigs again, to show an elegant solution to this kind of issue. So one of the levels in rigs had a lot of rippled sand on the ground. It was the Dubai level in that game. And it looked excellent, you know, really, really nice kind of rippled sand. But the ripples in the sand create a busy and regular pattern. And left unchecked, that will create high optical flow for the player. So we can see there the kind of pattern that I'm talking about. So rigs employs what I think is a distance-based shader to disable the parallax maps and the shadows, and I'm not an artist, so I might be wrong about what specific aspect they were treating there. But the result of that is that the closer to the player you get, the more of that detail is stripped down, and you're just left with the color of the texture. The result is that the surface directly under the player's view, where optical flow could cause the most damage, has been made a lot smoother than it is at distance. That means the player can still see the nice rippled sand effect in the area of the screen they're actually looking at. I want to talk a little bit about convergence points using a couple of slides here. Now, very dark shadows and very bright lights can leave the player unable to fix their eyes on the correct convergence point for a particular surface. So by that, what I mean is that they can't make out the surface they're supposed to be focusing on, so their eyes converge at infinity. And if the player's eyes are frequently moving between a defined surface and a surface in which they can't discern the surface, that convergence is frequently contracting and relaxing, and that becomes uncomfortable, can create eye strain. So dark shadows in a room, very bright lights, anything that kind of removes a sort of known surface that you can fix your eyes upon is the risk. And it doesn't mean you can't have shadows and lights in your VR game, of course, but you just need to be aware of the potential consequences in VR. Watch the top and the bottom end, and also the frequency of their use. A variant on this can also be the case with reflective surfaces. Now, I want to be clear here that I'm not talking about shiny surfaces. I specifically mean reflective surfaces that exhibit mirror-like behavior. So as you all know, if you're looking at a mirror, your eyes are going to converge at a point beyond the surface of that mirror. If you have many reflective surfaces in your environment, then again, the player's eyes are going to be converging at a depth beyond the surface, reconverging at the depth that is the correct level for the surface. And if that happens frequently, eye strain is going to be one of the results, fatigue, other negative symptoms. Right, so section 5 here, I'd like to talk about effective testing for VR. I'll start with another very useful document. This is the Simulator Sickness Questionnaire, often referred to as the SSQ. Again, I'll link to this document directly when I share this presentation. It's put together by US Navy in '95, and it's based on investigations using 10 flight simulators and over 1,600 subject exposures. And it categorizes a number of simulation sickness symptoms, the most common being fatigue, sweating, nausea, eye strain. There's 16 in total. And it is also a really good place to start when determining how you go about your testing. But I wanted to take you through a few kind of guidelines for conducting simulator sickness testing, that can, whether you use the SSQ or any other kind of system. So firstly, before and after questioning is critical. If you don't know how someone is feeling before they play your game, you can't know the effect that the game has had on them. Another key aspect is to avoid averaging all results, because this can conceal the worst cases. You know, in many things, an average of numbers doesn't really give you a true picture of the worst situation there. So instead of averaging, I would recommend focusing on the percentage of players who exhibited moderate and severe responses in their symptoms. The SSQ presents symptoms as levels of none, slight, moderate, and severe. So moderate and severe is the end that I tend to focus on. It's important to ask players about whether they would play again, and in particular here, you're interested in players who wouldn't play again due to discomfort. Now, there may be players who wouldn't play again for other reasons. They may not have had fun, and that's not desirable, but the thing that you're interested in here is players who wouldn't play again specifically due to simulation sickness related. So we found this to be perhaps one of the most important metrics, Because if players would return, then you are giving them the opportunity to acclimatize to your experience. You might be taking them a little bit towards discomfort, but if they're still engaged and they still want to come back, then over time they will build up. As I referred to early on, if someone wouldn't return due to discomfort, then that's it. Doesn't matter how much better it would get if they stuck around for a week, because they've told you in plain terms that isn't what's going to happen. High participant numbers are really crucial. It kind of goes without saying for any kind of data-driven surveying. Ideally, not less than 100 participants per test, but of course that may not be practical for a lot of tests that you're doing. If 100's not possible, then you've got to treat the results with caution. I would also say that you should always apply standard normal distribution to your results, especially with lower participant numbers, to give you a clear balance, thank you, to give you an idea of the confidence that you can have in your results based on the number of participants, but also the range of results that you got through them. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. VR noobs are good. If you're going to be testing with VR virgins, that's the best state of affairs to be in, because an acclimatized player can only give you better results than the worst case. So you should be dealing with the worst case, and ideally, every single time you test, you're dealing with people who've never used VR before. So a little bit of advice for prototyping. This is the thing to be really strict about, and it's a very strong temptation. You aren't prototyping fun. Fun is important, but if you have significant problems with comfort in your VR experience, this has to be your priority when you're prototyping solutions to those problems. Even prototypes that are clearly unsuitable for your gameplay may still teach you something useful, which you can then bring back into the game further down the road. And also, if discomfort is very severe, then you don't really have fun, as I stated earlier. You don't really have gameplay. So it's got to be the number one issue, and when you're prototyping, that's the thing to keep in mind. The second one is change only a single thing between variants. This applies to a lot of any kind of sort of comparative testing. If you create multiple variants, you can test them back to back, but you've got to be only changing one thing in each of those variants. Otherwise, the data that you're going to get back is going to be useless to you. This kind of goes without saying throughout any stage of development in VR, but particularly for testing. If you're not maintaining performance, then all you're going to get back is results that tell you that poor frame rate impacts comfort in VR. And what you're also going to lose is the separation between the different variants, the different ideas or concepts that you were trying to prove out. And this brings me back really to the point I was trying to make right at the start there about understanding the first principles, that if you apply that to your work, including your testing and your prototyping, you will be able to make less prototypes. You'll be able to make prototypes that take you in the right direction. And overall, you will achieve a higher level of comfort in any experience that you set out to make. It's actually comparatively trivial to make a very comfortable VR experience, but it's not trivial to make an original one that is still comfortable. If you're going to go somewhere that no one else has gone before, that's a real challenge. But simulation sickness that gets too severe is going to waste the effort. So that brings me to the end, just in time, I think. I hope you found it useful. As I said, I'll get this presentation shared. There's our website again and our Twitter feed. Over about the next week, I'm going to try and get this presentation shared and include an extra slide with links to all the documents. All that remains is for me to say thank you very much, and if we have time, some questions, if there are any. Thank you. No questions? Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time. Cheers.